Hey, so tonight we're going to dive into one of the strangest and most uncomfortable corners of medieval medicine. The belief that women could be healed through forced orgasms. Imagine walking into a physician's chamber, not for pleasure, not for intimacy, but because your family thinks you're sick. The treatment isn't herbs or bloodletting or prayer, it's stimulation, a doctor's hand, sometimes an instrument, sometimes even midwives hired specifically to relieve a woman of her supposed illness. It sounds like a parody, but it was deadly serious. Medieval doctors inherited this idea from the ancient Greeks, especially Hippocrates and Galen. They believed in something called female hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for nearly any symptom: anxiety, sadness, fainting spells, even headaches. The theory was grotesque but simple. The womb was thought to be restless, even wandering through the body, poisoning the mind if it wasn't satisfied. The cure: induce what they politely called paroxysmus, in plain terms, orgasm. This wasn't whispered about in secret corners. It was written in medical manuals, taught in universities, practiced in towns across Europe. The logic was drenched in misogyny. Women were considered incomplete men, ruled by their wombs, and their ailments all traced back to sexual frustration. The treatment was humiliating, but it was normalised. A priest might rail against lust from the pulpit, then a physician down the street prescribed it as medicine. And it wasn't a quick process. Doctors described it clinically, as if it were no different than lancing a boil. Some texts instructed physicians to rub oil or musky ointments on a woman's thighs and genitals until the disorder was relieved. The woman's moans or cries weren't heard as pleasure. They were evidence of a cure. In a society where women's voices were silenced, even their pleasure was rewritten as sickness. For wealthy women, the treatment was cloaked in ritual. Candles, incense, soft linens. A physician might create an atmosphere resembling a religious act. For peasants, it was cruder. A midwife might be called into a hut, asked to release a young wife whose melancholy had made her useless in the fields. Either way, the body wasn't seen as her own. It was an object, a vessel to be manipulated back into order for the sake of family and society. You can almost picture it: a cold chamber, the air heavy with smoke from tallow candles. A woman lies on a rough wooden table, her skirts bunched awkwardly, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, while the physician mutters about the wandering womb. Her husband paces outside, waiting for his wife to be cured. In a few minutes, the doctor will emerge, wipe his hands on a rag, and declare her hysteria subdued. The humiliation, never spoken of again. This practice carried a dangerous undertone of exploitation. Many women had no say in the matter. They weren't patients in the modern sense. They were bodies to be corrected. And in some cases, physicians treated them repeatedly, building a profitable business out of their supposed hysteria. A woman's suffering was monetized, sexualized, and medicalized all at once. And so, the grotesque truth is this: in the Middle Ages, a woman's orgasm wasn't considered hers to enjoy. It was rebranded as medicine, controlled by male hands, justified as science, a cure that was really another form of domination. When medieval doctors spoke of curing hysteria, they didn't just mean their hands. They had an arsenal of substances and tools that blurred the line between medicine and ritual, and sometimes bordered on the absurd. First came the ointments. Medical texts recommend oils of musk, myrrh, or even animal fat, mixed with herbs considered warming. The logic was rooted in humoral theory. The womb, seen as cold and moist, needed heat to restore balance. Doctors prescribed rubbing these unguents not just on the belly, but directly on the genitals. Thick, pungent pastes were applied by physicians or midwives under the pretense of therapy. Imagine lying on a table while a man mutters about balancing your humours, smearing goose fat or spiced oil between your legs. It wasn't comfort. It was humiliation disguised as medicine. Then came fumigations. Some manuals recommended burning herbs beneath a woman while she sat on a perforated chair, the smoke rising into her body. Frankincense, fennel, even burning pitch were said to draw down the wandering womb. The idea was that the womb was like a restless animal, attracted to pleasant smells and repelled by foul ones. In practice, this meant women were forced to sit, sweating and coughing, while smoke billowed around them. If the womb didn't behave, more direct manual methods followed. And then there were instruments. Though the earliest vibrators wouldn't appear until the 19th century, medieval physicians were not without their crude tools. Some used pestles, others smooth stone or carved wood, applying oils to ease friction. They described them not as sexual but therapeutic, carefully cloaked in the language of medicine. What modern readers would instantly recognise as invasive, they presented as clinical routine. The absurdity becomes clearer when you realise how systematised it was. Doctors wrote detailed instructions, massage until signs of paroxysm are achieved. This may include trembling, heat in the face, or sudden relaxation. These weren't love manuals, they were cold prescriptions. Women's bodies were reduced to symptoms and responses, their pleasure redefined as pathology. The line between exploitation and treatment was paper thin. Many midwives became experts in inducing orgasm, hired by households to calm daughters or wives. Wealthy women in noble courts sometimes preferred female attendants, believing their touch less sinful than that of a man. But even then, the dynamic was steeped in shame. Relief was temporary, symptoms returned, and the cycle began again, profitable for practitioners, miserable for patients. And it wasn't always voluntary. Accounts survive of women being restrained for fumigation or massage when they resisted, their complaints dismissed as symptoms of hysteria itself. If a woman protested, it only proved the doctor's point. She was sick and therefore needed the cure. It was a trap with no exit. You can almost see the scene. A dim chamber, walls hung with dried herbs, jars of grease and oils lining a shelf. A woman lies rigid, jaw clenched, as a physician dips his fingers into perfumed ointment. He mutters about the restless womb while she stares at the ceiling, trying to endure the shame. Outside, her family waits, reassured that the doctor is treating her. Inside, she's stripped of dignity, her body rewritten as a problem to be solved by hands that never asked permission. What makes it worse is how normalised it became. Manuals praised the effectiveness of this therapy. Teachers and universities repeated it to generations of students. No one called it abuse, it was just medicine. And so, oils, smoke, and crude tools became the accepted arsenal for curing a condition that didn't exist. If there's one idea that fueled centuries of bizarre treatments, it was the myth of the wandering womb. Medieval doctors didn't invent it. They inherited it from ancient Greece, but they clung to it like gospel. The womb, they believed, was not fixed in place. Instead, it was a restless organ, drifting through the female body like a living creature, pressing against the lungs, the heart, even the brain. Wherever it went, it caused trouble. Symptoms of this wandering were almost limitless. Trouble breathing. The womb was pressing on the chest, anxiety or fainting. The womb had climbed toward the head. Pain in the belly? The womb was sulking in its rightful home. To male physicians, the female body was a battlefield against its own reproductive organ, and the only way to keep it in check was through release. That's why orgasm became rebranded as medicine. A satisfied womb stayed put, calm and content. A neglected womb roamed, stirring hysteria, suffocation, or madness. Doctors frame this in cold clinical terms. But beneath the jargon was a deep fear of female sexuality. Women's bodies were mysteries to male physicians, so they pathologized what they didn't understand. Desire wasn't natural. It was dangerous. Pleasure wasn't private. It was mandatory treatment. You can almost picture the absurdity. A physician explaining to a husband that his wife's depression is not spiritual or emotional, but the result of her womb trying to crawl into her throat. The cure, of course, is intercourse or manual stimulation. And if the husband isn't up to the task, the doctor is ready to help. The myth went even further. Some texts claimed the womb responded to smells. Sweet aromas like lavender, myrrh, or cinnamon would lure it downward, while foul odours like burning hair or garlic drove it away from the chest. This led to treatments where women were forced to inhale reeking fumes, while perfumed oils were applied between their legs. Imagine being told your very survival depends on enduring a noxious ritual, all because men believed your uterus was wandering like a strayed dog. And the worst part, women rarely had the chance to argue. If they resisted, it only reinforced the diagnosis. Their protests were labelled hysteria itself. Their silence was taken as proof that the treatment worked. In either case, their voices were erased, swallowed by a myth written into the bones of medical theory. The wandering womb wasn't just pseudoscience, it was control. It reduced women to vessels, their minds irrelevant, their dignity dismissed. Every fainting spell, every mood, every illness could be explained away by this one organ. And with the explanation came the license. Physicians and midwives were authorised to intervene, to touch, to cure. It's telling that this myth lasted so long. From ancient Greece to the Middle Ages and beyond, the idea of the wandering womb offered men a convenient framework. It explained what they didn't understand, justified what they wanted to do, and silenced the women who endured it. Science cloaked the shame in legitimacy. And so, in smoky chambers and draughty huts, women were subjected to treatments born not of healing, but of superstition and fear. A myth became medicine. A natural body became a problem. An orgasm, something that should have been intimate and personal, became another tool of control. Picture this, a smoky chamber lit by guttering tallow candles, their greasy smoke clinging to the rafters. The physician's table is little more than a rough plank with a wool blanket thrown across it. Clay jars line a crooked shelf, some filled with perfumed oils, others with pungent mixtures of animal fat and herbs. This is not a place of comfort. It is a place where a woman's body is stripped of dignity, reduced to a specimen for male hands to manipulate. A young wife enters, her family whispering outside the door. She hasn't smiled in weeks, perhaps suffering from exhaustion or despair. But the physician doesn't ask about her feelings. Instead, he announces confidently that she suffers from hysteria. Her womb, he declares, has become restless. The cure is simple: release. She's told to lie down, skirts gathered awkwardly, while he prepares the treatment. The process is clinical in tone, but intimate in violation. Oil is warmed over the small fire and mixed with crushed herbs. The doctor dips his fingers into the mixture. muttering about restoring balance to her humours. He applies the ointment slowly, deliberately, ignoring her rigid body and averted eyes. To him, her tension isn't fear, it's confirmation of illness. To her, it is shame beyond words. Some manuals advise that the woman should be encouraged to relax, to breathe deeply, to allow the paroxysm to come. But in reality, this wasn't relaxation, it was endurance. The physician worked methodically, waiting for the signs he had been trained to observe: trembling, flushed cheeks, perhaps a gasp or a sudden release of tension. These were not markers of pleasure, but of cure. He would note them with the same detachment he might show when lancing a boil. For poorer women, the scene was harsher. Midwives were often tasked with inducing orgasm, their hands considered more socially acceptable than those of a man. But that didn't make the process any less invasive. In a cold hut with no privacy, a woman might be laid out on straw while neighbours gossiped outside. Her cries, muffled or stifled, were dismissed as symptoms. Relief was temporary, but the humiliation lingered. Sometimes fumigation was added to the ordeal. Imagine sitting on a wooden stool pierced with holes, a brazier burning beneath you. The fumes of pungent herbs rise, acrid and choking, as the midwife fans the smoke upward. Your eyes water, your throat burns, and through it all, the practitioner watches carefully for signs that the womb has been coaxed back into place. If you resist or cry out, it only proves the treatment is necessary. What's most striking is the utter absence of consent. These women were not patients in control of their treatment. They were bodies acted upon, diagnosed without choice, healed without permission. Their protest could be dismissed as hysteria, their silence taken as compliance. Either way, the cycle continued. The language of the medical text reveals the coldness of it all. Words like massage, paroxysmus, fumigation stripped away the reality, turning intimate violation into sterile procedure. Doctors prided themselves on professionalism, yet their cures were inseparable from exploitation. The supposed science gave cover to practices that blurred into abuse. Step into that chamber in your mind, feel the damp chill of the stone walls, hear the crackle of the brazier beneath you, the hiss of oil heating in a pan, smell the bitter mix of herbs and sweat, then imagine lying still as a man dictates that your body is unwell and that his touch, unwanted, clinical, invasive, is the cure. This was not healing. It was control disguised as medicine. And so, session after humiliating session, women endured treatments built on a myth. Their suffering was catalogued as medical progress, their dignity erased by ink on parchment. The wandering womb may not have existed, but its shadow shaped centuries of lives. Not every woman in the Middle Ages was dragged onto the physician's table for hysteria, but some were far more vulnerable than others, and the reasons reveal as much about society as they do about medicine. Young, unmarried women were common targets. If a girl appeared moody, pale, or withdrawn, her behaviour was read as illness rather than personality. Families feared such symptoms might make her unmarriageable, so they sought out doctors to correct her womb before it ruined her prospects. For these women, treatment wasn't about health. It was about restoring their market value in the marriage economy. Newly married wives were also frequent patients. If a woman struggled to conceive, or if she seemed listless in her household duties, physicians often diagnosed hysteria. The cure: release the womb, calm the body, and supposedly restore fertility. Many women likely endured repeated treatments, caught in a cycle of shame, because their worth was tied so tightly to producing heirs. Widows were another category altogether. In a culture suspicious of single women, widows were often portrayed as lustful or dangerous if they weren't subdued. Their independence was threatening, their sexuality suspect. If a widow showed signs of melancholy, physicians claimed her womb was restless from lack of satisfaction. Treatment was framed as a moral duty to keep her from becoming disruptive to society. Imagine being dragged into a chamber, not because you're sick, but because you're inconvenient. And then there were the wealthy, paradoxically, upper-class women, shielded from the hardships of peasant life, were often more exposed to these rituals. Affluent families could afford physicians, and doctors loved treating wealthy patients because they paid well. The women themselves had little choice. Their ailments, whether sadness, anxiety or fatigue, were filtered through the same lens: hysteria. Their money bought them elaborate treatments, perfumed oils, rituals with incense, even multiple attendants. But the underlying indignity was the same. Peasant women, meanwhile, had fewer resources but weren't immune. Instead of doctors, midwives were called upon to administer crude therapies. Relief was sought not in stone-walled chambers, but in huts, barns, even fields. A farmer's wife who broke down from exhaustion might be pinned to a bench while a midwife worked with calloused hands, urged on by her husband. For these women, medicine was another form of labour, endured quickly, quietly, and often violently. It's important to remember why this cycle persisted. The treatments were profitable. Physicians earned repeat business from families desperate to restore their daughters, wives or mothers, to normalcy. And because hysteria was defined so vaguely, the cure was never permanent. Symptoms always returned, justifying more visits, more money, more shame. You can imagine the cruel loop. A young bride feels trapped, her mind heavy with despair. Instead of compassion, her husband hires a physician. The treatment humiliates her further, deepening her suffering. Her silence afterward is taken as proof of cure, until the despair returns, and she's once again led to the chamber. Each session strips away more of her dignity, while filling the physician's purse. The absurdity is sharper when you realise how gendered it all was. Men could suffer from melancholy, exhaustion or headaches without being accused of hysteria. They might be bled, purged or prescribed wine and rest. Women, however, had only one explanation offered: their wombs. No matter the symptom, the diagnosis always circled back to their sexuality. It was medicine weaponized to reinforce inequality. So who got treated? Nearly every kind of woman, young or old, rich or poor, married or widowed. The common thread was that they were women, and their suffering could be moulded into a story about restless wombs and wandering organs. A story that gave men the authority to intervene and left women stripped of choice. The medieval church had a paradoxical relationship with women's bodies. On the one hand, priests thundered from the pulpit about lust being a deadly sin, about women as temptresses leading men to damnation. On the other hand, when it came to hysteria and the so-called wandering womb, the church turned a blind eye to some of the most invasive treatments. In fact, it often worked hand in hand with physicians, reinforcing the same misogynistic narratives. From the church's perspective, a woman's body was a site of sin. If she was melancholic, if she fainted, if she laughed too freely, priests might say she was possessed by demons. But more often they borrowed from the language of medicine. Her womb was restless, her body corrupt, her desires dangerous. Both medicine and religion agreed on the root problem. Women were ruled by their sexuality, and both offered cures. For priests, it was confession, fasting, or prayer. For doctors, it was oils, fumigation, and orgasm. The hypocrisy is staggering. Priests condemned women for lust, yet when doctors claimed that orgasm was medical necessity, the practice was tolerated. As long as it was framed as treatment, not pleasure, the church looked away. Doctors cloaked their work in Latin jargon, and that was enough to keep it respectable. But sometimes the church did more than look away. It actively reinforced the stigma that kept women silent. If a woman complained about the treatment, her protest could be interpreted as hysteria itself. Worse, priests might brand her resistance as sin, or even witchcraft. A woman who refused to be healed became suspicious. Was she hiding lust? Was she consorting with demons? Either way, the system closed around her. There were also blurred lines between medicine and religion in practice. Some physicians recommended prayers or blessings alongside the treatment. Certain convents even employed midwives who combined fumigation rituals with holy water, as if sanctifying the process could make it less shameful. Imagine kneeling for confession, only to have a priest prescribe both a rosary and a trip to the physician's chamber. At the same time, women in religious orders weren't immune. Nuns who showed signs of melancholy or fits were sometimes diagnosed with hysteria too. Convents called in physicians or midwives to calm troubled sisters. The irony is painful. Women who had sworn chastity were subjected to treatments built entirely on forced sexual release. Yet, as long as it was described as curing the womb, it was permitted. The church's biggest role, though, was silence. It kept alive the idea that women's bodies were mysterious, dangerous, and in need of control. It promoted fear of female sexuality, which justified both sermons and medical interventions. In sermons, women were Eve's daughters, always threatening to drag men into sin. In medicine, they were restless vessels whose wombs threatened to strangle them from within. Different language, same conclusion, women needed to be managed. This double standard shows just how tightly religion and medicine were intertwined. Both systems worked to preserve male authority, and both turned women's suffering into an opportunity for control. Priests controlled their souls, physicians controlled their bodies, and between them there was little room left for women's voices. Step into a medieval town square in your imagination. A priest preaches about chastity, while across the street, a physician advertises his services for curing hysteria. A woman listening knows she could be trapped by either man. To the priest, her desire is sin. To the doctor, her desire is disease. And either way, her body isn't hers to command. If wealthy women endured humiliation in stone-walled chambers with perfumed oils and educated physicians, the reality for peasant women was even harsher. Their world was not lined with shelves of ointments and Latin texts, but with mud floors, smoky hearths, and the constant press of survival. Yet even here, the myth of hysteria found its way in, reshaping their suffering into something that demanded cure. A farmer's wife who broke down from exhaustion might collapse while carrying water or weeding the fields. Her husband, baffled and anxious, didn't call it depression or grief. He muttered that her womb had gone restless. The local midwife, often the only available healer, was summoned. Her methods were crude, built from whispers of medical manuals and village tradition. She might heat pungent herbs over the fire, placing the woman on a stool while smoke curled beneath her skirts. She might rub grease or tallow between the woman's thighs, calling it medicine. To the peasant community, this was not abuse, it was necessity. Privacy was a luxury peasants couldn't afford. Treatments might be performed in a communal space with children peeking through cracks in the wall or neighbours gossiping outside. Imagine the shame of a woman forced to endure a humiliating procedure while the people she lived among every day speculated about her womb. There was no dignity in it, only the hope that afterwards she could return to her chores without fainting again. And yet, the poorest women often had no choice at all. Some were restrained by husbands or elders, their protests dismissed as further proof of hysteria. Others endured treatments in silence, too fearful of being branded lazy, sinful, or possessed. In a society where women's labour was essential for survival, any weakness became a burden, and burdens were treated not with kindness but with remedies that blurred into punishment. There were darker undertones too. In villages, hysteria could overlap with superstition. A woman who cried too much, who seemed melancholy, or who resisted fumigation could quickly be accused of witchcraft. Why else would she reject healing? Neighbours whispered. In these cases, the treatments became both medical and disciplinary, a way to mark her as abnormal, even dangerous. The emotional toll was profound. Relief, if it came, was temporary. Shame lingered long after the symptoms returned. Women internalized the idea that their bodies were defective, their wombs treacherous, their minds untrustworthy. Instead of solidarity, they were offered silence. Instead of compassion, smoke and grease. Step into that hut for a moment. The floor is packed earth, damp from last night's rain. A woman sits stiffly on a stool, skirts gathered as her midwife tends to the brazier beneath. Smoke curls upward, stinging her eyes. Her husband stands nearby, arms folded, watching for signs of improvement. She doesn't cry out. She doesn't dare. The treatment isn't just for her body. It's a test of her obedience. This was the reality for countless peasant women. While history preserves the manuals of physicians and the sermons of priests, the voices of these women are lost. Their experiences exist only in fragments, glimpsed through accusations, complaints, or the occasional note in a doctor's ledger. Yet their suffering was no less real, no less humiliating. The wandering womb may have been a myth, but its shadow reached even into the humblest huts, reshaping women's lives at every level of society. Whether rich or poor, noble or peasant, they could not escape the grip of a diagnosis that reduced their humanity to the movements of a single organ. By the later Middle Ages, medicine was no longer confined to smoky huts and private chambers. In university towns like Bologna, Paris and Montpellier, students gathered in wooden lecture halls to watch their professors demonstrate the newest techniques. These medical theatres were supposed to be temples of learning, but for women dragged into them, they were arenas of humiliation. Picture the scene. Tiered benches packed with young men in rough scholars' robes. The smell of ink, sweat and candle wax filling the air. At the centre, on a raised platform, stands the professor. His voice carries across the room, heavy with Latin phrases about humours and wandering wombs. Before him sits a chair, or sometimes a low table. Onto it, an assistant helps a woman climb, a patient chosen for her supposed hysteria. The students lean forward, eager. This is not abstract theory from a dusty text. This is live demonstration. The professor explains how hysteria manifests: sudden fits, melancholy, fainting spells. He lectures about how the womb must be calmed. Then, with clinical detachment, he demonstrates the massage or fumigation prescribed. Every motion is narrated as science, but the spectacle is undeniable. A woman's most private suffering is turned into a lesson, her body exposed before dozens of strangers. Some women were brought unwillingly. Families pressured by the promise of free treatment at the university offered their daughters or wives as subjects. Others came under threat, accused of madness or even witchcraft if they refused. Either way, their dignity was not a consideration. To the scholars, they were bodies, case studies in flesh. The crowd of students scribbled notes furiously. They recorded how to warm oils, how to observe the signs of release, how to distinguish genuine hysteria from stubbornness. But they also whispered and laughed. Accounts from the time reveal the ribald jokes of medical students, their fascination with the spectacle. For them, it was equal parts education and entertainment. These demonstrations blurred the line between healing and exploitation. The woman's experience was erased, her discomfort reframed as evidence. If she wept, the professor explained it as hysteria. If she grew still, he called it cure. The performance reinforced the myth, turning abuse into a polished ritual, sanctified by Latin terminology and the authority of the university. What's striking is how normalized it became. For centuries, medical texts were copied and recopied, spreading the same instructions. Professors cited Aristotle, Galen, and Avicenna to justify their methods. The prestige of tradition gave legitimacy to what was essentially state-sanctioned violation. And every generation of physicians carried the practice forward, teaching it anew to fresh classes of eager students. Imagine yourself on one of those benches. You lean forward, quill in hand, watching as the professor places his hands with steady confidence. You smell the sharp tang of herbs burned in a brazier, hear the stifled sobs of the patient, and feel the room's strange tension, a mix of reverence for learning and unspoken titillation. You write the word paroxysmus in your notes, never questioning what it means for the woman on the table. The medical theatre elevated hysteria from village superstition to institutional science. And in doing so, it cemented the myth even further. Not only was the wandering womb a real diagnosis, it was publicly demonstrated, dissected, and performed for the next generation of doctors. Women's suffering became curriculum, their humiliation became tradition. This was the cold reality of medieval healing, spectacle masquerading as science, curiosity hiding cruelty, and entire rooms of men trained to believe that women's bodies were problems to be solved with invasive hands. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, some physicians began to grow uneasy with how much their treatments relied on direct touch. Manuals describe the doctor's hands as the most efficient instrument. But in a culture obsessed with propriety, even medicine had to find ways to mask its intimacy. And so, devices began to appear, crude mechanical tools designed to simulate the same outcome, while cloaking it in a layer of supposed professionalism. The earliest were little more than extensions of the hand, wooden or metal rods, sometimes wrapped in cloth and soaked in oil, were recommended for physicians who wished to avoid impropriety. In practice, these objects made the experience harsher. Wood splintered, metal chilled, and cloth carried infections. For the women forced to endure them, it was less treatment and more torment. Medical texts describe these tools in astonishingly frank terms, though always with the language of science. They were said to stimulate paroxysmus, restore circulation of humours, or encourage expulsion of ill vapours. The reality was cruder. They were designed to bring women to orgasm without the physician using his hands. What had once been intimate violation became mechanical violation. The shame remained, dressed now in brass and oak. By the 15th century, some physicians promoted entire contraptions. Manuscripts mention bellows-like devices to force smoke into the womb, and rotating instruments powered by hand cranks. Imagine lying on a wooden bench, skirts raised, while assistants pump air through pipes, filling your body with acrid fumes. The doctor calls it fumigation, but to the woman it is suffocating, invasive, humiliating. In cities, craftsmen even advertised tools for physicians. The same men who made surgical knives and bloodletting bowls also fashioned therapeutic rods and smoking chambers. These were sold alongside scalpels and forceps, their presence in a physician's kit lending legitimacy. A midwife might carry a simpler version, a smooth stone or polished piece of bone, wrapped in cloth and used again and again on multiple women, rarely cleaned. Infections spread, but no one connected them to the tools. Step into that chamber in your imagination again. A doctor presents his new device with pride, claiming it spares both him and his patient embarrassment. He dips it in perfumed oil, mutters a prayer, and inserts it with detached precision. To the men watching, assistants, students, perhaps even curious husbands, it looks scientific, almost respectable. To the woman trembling, it feels no different than the old way, an invasion disguised as cure. The rise of devices also reinforced the silence around women's pain. If a woman cried out, the physician could insist it was only the tool at work, not himself. If she resisted, he could claim that the procedure was cleaner, safer, less sinful than before. Instruments provided not only physical distance, but moral cover, making it easier to ignore the humanity of the patient. These tools were precursors to something larger. In centuries to come, they would evolve into elaborate mechanical massagers marketed as medical devices, inventions that blurred the line between treatment and abuse even further. But in the medieval period, their crude simplicity exposed the truth. No matter the shape or material, the myth of hysteria demanded the same result. And women's bodies paid the price. It's easy to imagine the cruel irony. A woman already shamed by her symptoms is told the new tool is a mark of progress. She should feel lucky, her husband says, that the doctor is using modern equipment. Yet in practice, she leaves more bruised, more sore, and more humiliated than before. Progress for medicine meant only deeper silence for her. And so the myth marched forward, armed not only with Latin texts and sermons, but with splintered wood, sharp brass and smoke-filled bellows. Professionalism had found its props, and women found themselves trapped in an even more clinical theatre of shame. When you read medieval medical texts, one thing jumps out. The women themselves are almost completely absent. Their voices do not speak. Their words do not survive. What we know of hysteria, of fumigation, of forced treatments, comes almost entirely from the pens of men. Physicians, priests, philosophers. Their perspective was seen as knowledge. Women's perspective was erased as weakness, gossip, or sin. Why? Silence was enforced. A woman who dared to describe her humiliation risked more than ridicule. She could be branded ungrateful, accused of resisting God's will, or worse, suspected of witchcraft. Complaints became evidence. Tears became symptoms. Resistance became proof that she needed even more treatment. The trap was inescapable. Consider the rare exceptions. Occasionally, a woman's words slip through in court records or letters. A widow in France described how a physician's cure left her in more pain than before, yet her testimony was dismissed as hysteria itself. In England, a woman's husband testified on her behalf that she had cried during treatment, but the judge simply noted she must have been cured if she was quiet afterward. Even these fragments remind us how impossible it was for women to control their own story. The cost of silence wasn't just personal, it was historical. Because women's voices were erased, the narrative of hysteria persisted unchallenged for centuries. Doctors cited one another, building a library of authority, never asking their patients what they felt. The myth of the wandering womb survived because those who suffered from its supposed treatments could not write or could not risk writing their truth. Think about it. A whole medical tradition existed for hundreds of years, based on the idea that women's wombs needed release. And yet we have not one diary, not one memoir, not one detailed testimony from a woman describing the ordeal in her own terms. That absence is itself a kind of violence, the silencing of half the population in the very subject of their own health. This silence also bred stigma that seeped into ordinary life. Women who had been treated often carried shame, never speaking of it to their daughters or sisters. The experience became a hidden wound, something endured alone. Generations passed, repeating the cycle, without anyone naming it aloud. What should have been condemned as cruelty was reframed as necessity. Step for a moment into the shoes of one of those women. You sit in the corner of your hut at dusk, the fire low, your children asleep nearby. You ache from the day's treatment, the smoke still lingering in your clothes. You want to tell someone, your mother, your neighbour, even your husband, that it felt wrong, degrading, unbearable. But you don't. You can't. You fear they will call you ungrateful. You fear they will say you're sick again. So you swallow your words. Your silence becomes another stone in the wall that hides the truth. The irony is sharp. Women's bodies were dissected, studied, and cured endlessly, yet their voices were erased from the record. History remembers their wombs, not their words. The cost of that silence echoes even now, because the myth of hysteria lasted into the modern era precisely because women were denied the power to say otherwise. When we reconstruct these stories today, we are left piecing together fragments from the men who controlled the narrative. It's like trying to understand a song by reading only the background notes, never the melody. The missing voices haunt the pages, reminding us that the silence was not natural, it was imposed. Behind every diagnosis of hysteria lay not just ignorance, but money. Medicine in the Middle Ages was not a free service. Every consultation, every prescription, every fumigation or massage was a transaction. And because hysteria was conveniently described as a chronic recurring condition, it guaranteed repeat customers. For physicians, hysteria was a goldmine. Unlike the plague or fevers that killed quickly, hysteria could linger for months, years, even a lifetime. A woman might be brought for treatment again and again, her husband or family paying each time. Manuals described hysteria as intractable, a condition that required constant management, which of course meant constant profit. Apothecaries joined the trade as well. They sold oils, ointments, perfumed cloths, and herbal mixtures specifically for calming the womb. These weren't cheap. Recipes called for rare resins, imported spices, and animal fats. Families paid dearly, hoping the right mixture would cure their wives or daughters. In practice, these substances only masked the humiliation of the treatment, coating it in cinnamon, myrrh, or lavender. But the apothecaries thrived. Even midwives, often caught between serving their neighbours and pleasing the authorities participated. Some charged for their own homemade remedies, smooth stones, fumigation herbs, cloths reused until they stank. In rural villages, women were forced to pay in chickens, grain or labour if they couldn't afford coins. The suffering of one woman could feed another's family, turning humiliation into barter. And hovering above all of this was the church. Priests and confessors might not take money directly for curing hysteria, but they benefited in other ways. The myth reinforced sermons about sin, lust, and female weakness. Every frightened family who paid a physician also paid tithes at church. Every humiliated woman was a reminder of the church's authority over the body and soul. Universities, too, built their wealth on the diagnosis. Students paid fees to attend lectures where hysteria was demonstrated. Professors published treatises, securing prestige that translated into patronage. The spectacle of women suffering became a commodity, something young doctors paid to witness, something wealthy patrons supported to spread knowledge. The cycle fed itself. The more women suffered, the more doctors could write, the more apothecaries could sell, the more priests could preach. And because women were silenced, the system was never challenged from below. Medicine claimed authority, religion sanctified it, and commerce profited from it. Step into a medieval market square. An apothecary's stall smells of herbs and oils. A husband haggles for a jar of balm, said to calm his wife's womb. Down the street, a doctor advertises consultations, boasting of his new methods. Meanwhile, the church bell rings, calling women to confession, where their sins will be tied neatly to their wombs. Each part of the system feeds the next, and every coin flows upward. For women, hysteria wasn't just an illness. It was an industry that consumed their dignity. Their bodies became resources, their suffering fuel for the engines of economy and authority. The wandering womb wasn't only a myth, it was a business model. The story of hysteria wasn't only about humiliation. Sometimes it crossed into outright brutality. When gentle fumigation or oils failed, medieval doctors and families reached for harsher methods, convinced the womb had to be forced back into submission. Restraint was common. If a woman thrashed or resisted treatment, leather straps or rough ropes were used to bind her to a bench or stool. Manuals even recommended it, lest she do herself harm or interrupt the procedure. In truth, the restraint was less about safety and more about silencing her defiance. Once tied down, she had no choice but to endure whatever the doctor decided. Some physicians escalated to heat. Smoking herbs were burned directly beneath the skirts, often so close the skin blistered. The theory was that heat would draw down the wandering womb. The reality was agony. Women cried, fainted, sometimes burned. Yet these outcomes were dismissed as temporary, even desirable, proof that the treatment was working. Others employed cold. Ice or snow was applied to the chest or face while fire smoked below. The shock was said to fix the humours. Imagine lying bound while your body shivered violently, assaulted from above and below. The goal wasn't comfort, it was control. There were darker still stories. In some records, women were bled excessively, weakened to the point of collapse. Physicians explained this as balancing humours, but the truth was simpler. They had no idea what they were doing. A woman who could no longer struggle was called calmed, even as her life drained away. Violence sometimes came not from doctors, but from husbands. A wife who resisted fumigation might be beaten until she agreed. A daughter who wept during treatment might be struck for shaming her family. In villages, neighbours sometimes gathered to hold down a hysterical woman, their combined force ensuring the ritual went forward. What should have been healing became a communal act of domination. Step into one of those rooms. The air is heavy with smoke. A woman is tied to a wooden bench, her wrists red where the rope digs into her skin. The doctor crouches below, stoking the brazier, while her husband presses a hand against her shoulder to keep her still. She squirms, pleads, but her voice is drowned out by the crackle of flames and the murmured Latin above her. This is not medicine, it is torment under the banner of cure. What's striking is how little resistance these practices met. Manuals praised them, priests blessed them, families accepted them as unfortunate but necessary. To question them was to question the entire structure of authority, medical, religious, social. And so, the violence continued, unchallenged, dressed in the robes of tradition. The cruelty had another cost. It hardened women's silence. If humiliation wasn't enough to prevent them from speaking, violence sealed their lips. Better to endure quietly than risk worse. The brutality was not a deviation from the system. It was part of its design, a way to enforce obedience as well as cure. Hysteria, in this sense, was never just a diagnosis. It was a mechanism of control. The treatments were not only meant to heal, but to remind women of their place, bound, silenced, and dominated, their bodies property of husbands, doctors, and God. And so, what began as superstition about a wandering womb became a justification for violence. Violence sanctified as science, cruelty reframed as cure. Despite the silence imposed on them, women were not entirely passive victims. History preserves faint traces, like whispers carried through time, of how they resisted, mocked, or quietly undermined the system that humiliated them. These moments didn't overturn the myth of hysteria, but they revealed resilience, and sometimes a biting sense of irony. In village gossip, women often turn the diagnosis into a joke. A neighbour who complained too loudly might be teased as womb mad, her friends laughing at the absurdity rather than believing it. Humour became a shield. By laughing at the idea, women made it less powerful, even if only among themselves. Folk remedies also served as acts of defiance. Instead of submitting to humiliating fumigations, women passed around their own cures. A hot drink, a poultice, a charm whispered at night. These treatments may not have been effective, but they were chosen by women for women, a way of reclaiming agency. They rejected the physician's invasive hand in favour of shared traditions, quietly undermining male authority. There are stories of midwives who acted as protectors rather than enforcers. Some would pretend to follow medical texts, going through the motions of fumigation while actually using harmless herbs or gently applying warm cloths. They performed the ritual without the cruelty, fooling husbands and priests who demanded treatment. These small acts of mercy left no records in Latin manuscripts, but they lived on in the trust of the women who whispered about them afterward. In cities, some women mocked the practice openly. Plays and poems, often anonymous, contained veiled references to wandering wombs and cures. The jokes were risky. To laugh too loudly at medicine was to risk accusations of heresy. But satire survived. One medieval French tale described a healer who grew rich fumigating women until he accidentally set his own beard on fire and ran screaming through the village. Laughter, even disguised, chipped away at authority. Occasionally, resistance turned physical. Chronicles mention women who spat at doctors, who kicked over braziers mid-fumigation, who fled treatment rooms and locked themselves away. They were condemned as hysterical or possessed, but their actions spoke volumes. They refused to submit quietly. Step into one of these moments in your mind. A woman is strapped to a bench, smoke rising from the brazier at her feet. Suddenly she jerks her legs, sending the coals tumbling across the floor. The students scatter, robes smouldering, while she screams curses in her own tongue. The professor insists she's possessed, but beneath the chaos, her rebellion is clear. She will not play her role as quietly as they expect. Resistance was never easy. It came with consequences, punishment, ridicule, sometimes worse, but it existed and it mattered. Every laugh, every whispered charm, every act of refusal was a reminder that women saw through the facade of science and sanctity. They knew it was a lie. The tragedy is that these voices were almost entirely lost. Written history preserved the doctor's authority, not the women's defiance. What we glimpse now are only fragments, the ghostly outlines of a counter-story never fully told. But those fragments reveal something powerful. Even in the darkest circumstances, people find ways to resist. Even when silenced, they speak in whispers, in laughter, in rebellion. The myth of hysteria lasted centuries, not because women accepted it, but because their opposition was erased. The cost of silence was great, but the whispers remain. The myth of hysteria didn't die with the Middle Ages. It lingered, reshaped and adapted, casting a shadow that stretched across centuries. Even as science advanced, the old belief that women's bodies were unstable, unpredictable, in need of male control, refused to disappear. Instead, it dressed itself in new language, borrowed the vocabulary of progress, and survived. In the Renaissance, physicians still spoke of wandering wombs, though now with polished Latin and grander theories. They claimed to balance humours with more elaborate treatments, purges, bleedings, concoctions of opium and wine. The core remained the same. Women were defined as fragile, hysterical, needing constant intervention. And once again, intervention meant profit. By the Enlightenment, hysteria became a fashionable diagnosis. Women of the upper classes, especially, were said to be vulnerable. Doctors advertised cures ranging from mineral baths to electrical shocks. Parlours buzzed with stories of noble women swooning, their attacks treated by men with scientific instruments. The diagnosis was no longer confined to peasants in smoky rooms. It had become a cultural performance, binding women of all classes. And then came the 19th century. With industrialization came machines, and with machines came new tools to cure hysteria. Physicians openly used mechanical massagers to bring about paroxysm, their hands now replaced by vibrating devices. Ads described them as therapeutic, modern, scientific. But beneath the new machinery was the same old story. Women's pleasure reframed as illness. Women's bodies reduced to objects of control. This persistence had consequences beyond medicine. It shaped art, literature, and law. Novels portrayed hysterical heroines who collapsed into fainting fits, reinforcing stereotypes. Courtrooms used hysteria as a weapon to silence women, dismissing testimony as the ravings of an unstable mind. Even when women demanded rights, their opponents painted them as hysterical, their passion recast as pathology. Step into a 19th century clinic. A woman sits stiffly on a chair, while a physician demonstrates his new vibrating device to a room of male students. He explains it with precision, how it relieves congestion, how it calms the nervous system. The men nod, scribble notes and whisper. The woman stares at the floor, her humiliation hidden behind a lace veil. The instruments have changed, but the silence feels the same. What's most chilling is how long this shadow lasted. It wasn't until the 20th century that hysteria finally began to vanish from medical texts, stripped of legitimacy. But by then, the damage had been done. Centuries of women had been bound, smoked, strapped, massaged, silenced, their suffering reframed as science, their resistance erased. The myth of hysteria wasn't a relic, it was a chain, passed from age to age, disguised as medicine, draped in robes of progress. And even now echoes remain, whenever women's voices are dismissed as irrational, emotional, unstable. The long shadow still lingers. Looking back across the centuries, it is hard not to feel a chill. The story of hysteria was never just about medicine. It was about power, silence, humiliation, and the reshaping of women's lives under the pretense of healing. What began as a superstition about wandering wombs became a tradition of control, one that scarred generations of women, body and soul. The violence was not always physical, though often it was. The real violence lay in the erasure, the way women's own voices were silenced, their experiences dismissed, their suffering reframed as proof of sickness. The cruelty of fumigations, restraints, and humiliating cures was compounded by the knowledge that women could not even name it as cruelty. They endured while the men who claimed to heal them grew wealthy, praised, sanctified. And yet, amid this darkness, there were sparks of resistance, laughter in village kitchens, whispered remedies shared among midwives, satire smuggled into anonymous tales. Women found ways to survive, to mock, to endure. Their defiance may not have broken the system, but it kept alive the truth that hysteria was never real, that the sickness lay not in their bodies, but in the minds of those who claimed authority. The most unsettling truth is how long the shadow lasted. From smoky huts in medieval Europe to clinics humming with 19th century machines, the pattern persisted. Women's pleasure and pain stripped of dignity, converted into pathology. Even today, echoes remain whenever women are branded as overly emotional, their words dismissed as irrational. The ghost of hysteria lingers in the language of everyday life. Step back one last time into that dim medieval room. The smoke curls, the straps tighten, the doctor mutters in Latin while a woman lies silent, enduring. Now step into a modern room, a woman rolling her eyes as she's told she's just hormonal, her concerns brushed aside. Centuries apart, the pattern is disturbingly familiar. The costumes change, the instruments evolve, but the structure of dismissal survives. This is why these stories matter. They force us to remember what polite history tries to forget. The humiliations buried beneath science, the cruelty disguised as care, the laughter and resistance that somehow endured. They remind us that progress is never automatic. Every inch gained had to be fought for, whispered for, endured for. So the next time you hear the word hysterical, remember its shadow. Remember the smoke, the straps, the silence. Remember the women who bore the cost of a myth. And remember that the fight to be heard, to be believed, is not just a modern struggle. It is a battle as old as history itself.